Worse. Another major general is going to be Philip Schuyler. He's a very wealthy New York resident, and he's going to end up being Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, but more on that later. And then Israel Putnam, who is going to be at Bunker Hill. There's going to be 8 brigadier generals. So we're putting together a command structure. Washington finally arrives at Boston, or in the vicinity of Boston, not in the town, of course, because that's where all the British soldiers are. But he arrives in the outskirts of Boston on July 2nd, so a couple weeks after Bunker Hill, to take command. And when Washington arrives, he's disturbed. He's disgusted. Disturbed is not strong enough. He's disgusted by the chaos and the wretched conditions. There's no discipline. People are getting drunk. People are running around swearing. And by the way, Washington despised swearing. He would fine people later for swearing. He would punish people. He wanted people to, use nice language. The camps are filthy. People would just go to the bathroom wherever they felt like it. So there's literally crap everywhere, and it is just disgusting. And he realizes, all right, I've got to do something here. I've got to fix this. So he works to make the army more professional. He organizes the soldiers into Continental regiment. He's trying to remove state identifications. He wants to not have the 1st Rhode Island Regiment and the 1st New Hampshire Regiment. He wants to just have mixed regiments. That doesn't work out, but at least he tries. Now, the problem with this is there were about 16,000 troops around Boston, but less than 10,000 of them agreed to enlist into the Continental Army, and they enlist for 1 year. And that's going to be a constant problem, Scott. Washington is going to be dogged throughout the war by people just saying, oh, my enlistment's over. I'm going to go home. Kind of like Forrest Gump. After he did that long run, he ran across the country several times, and he finally goes, I'm tired. I think I'll go home now. So these people say, oh, I'm sorry, we're tired. We're going to go home. Well, what about patriotism? What about your country? What about liberty? And I don't care. I'm going home.
Probably said it word for word, like Forrest Gump said.
Yeah, maybe if they were from South Carolina or Georgia, perhaps.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we have to talk a little bit about Washington. If any of you listened to a previous series that James and I did, a Presidential Fight Club, probably one of the best things that's ever happened in podcasting history. Don't want to toot my own horn too much, or our horn
yes,
too much.
You must immediately after you finish this episode, go find it and listen to it. You'll love it, people.
I think it's a very unconventional take. Basically, it's all 44 presidents fighting each other one-on-one. Well, in that series, we got into a lot on what made Washington such a magnificent specimen. He's much taller than those around him, had incredible physical strength, could best much younger men in wrestling and fencing. He was a horseman, so many things about him, but there was an aura about him that some historians of the 19th century had a theory called the great man theory. Events in history are guided by those, whether through personal charisma, genius, divine providence, whatever you call it, are the ones that really bend the course of history. Not a very popular theory these days, but for those who are coming up in the 19th century, I'd like to think that they would have thought of Washington with that. And I just want to mention something very briefly from a biography on Washington called The Indispensable Man by James Flexner that came out in the 70s. And he describes Washington in this way. He was the glue that held the revolution together. Not only was he commander of the armies, though not without petty resentments from other generals, but he was the icon, the symbol of American resistance. If James Otis, Samuel Adams, and the Articles of Association drafted at the First Continental Congress were the sparks that ignited the revolution, making possible Jefferson's Great Declaration, and if John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were the kindling that gave it legal and philosophical sustenance at its beginning, Washington was the wood. And as long as the fuel remained, the fire burned. So there you go. High words of praise for Washington. And I understand you have some other background information. So let's see. Do you think the details of his biography meet that grand description?
Oh, yeah. By the way, let me say that I think that's a really good biography, especially as an introduction. So listener, if you want to read a biography of Washington, but you don't want to read several hundred pages, if you want to just read a couple hundred or 300, that's an excellent place to start. Flexner's Washington, the Indispensable Man. I read it. It's probably been 20 years now, but It's really good. We'll talk about another one a little bit later, another biography. But for now, let's do a mini bio of George Washington. As we go through this series, we're going to, when we get to a major character, we will stop and sketch them out a little bit, give you their background, talk about what brought them to the point, how they were formed, what, just their background and what made them the people they were at the beginning of the war. So Washington will probably get our longest one, and it's not going to be super long, just 3 more hours. So hang on there.
Dan Carlin length episode. Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. That'd be like some other podcasts I know. Nobody mentioned, but no, this will just be about probably 15 minutes or so. So, George Washington was born in 1732 in Northern Virginia. His father died when he was 11, and he was raised and educated by his mother and his brother Lawrence. He never got much of a formal education, though. He just didn't have the chance. He got involved in working very early on, and there were some money issues. From age 16 to 18, he worked as a surveyor. So he went out and surveyed land claims, and he got to know the Virginia backcountry very well. When he was 17, he moved to his brother Lawrence's estate, which was called Mount Vernon. That was named after an admiral in the British Navy, by the way, Scott. I don't know if you knew that. I learned that recently.
I did not. Interesting.
Lawrence had served in the Navy, and he liked this admiral so much that he named his house after him. So Mount Vernon, George moves there as a young man, and his brother Lawrence dies in 1752. And this is an interesting thing about the Washington family. The men tended to die pretty early. You didn't see any septuagenarians or octogenarians. I mean, they would die in their 40s, maybe 50s if they were lucky. Lawrence got really sick and died in 1752. George is only 20, so he inherited Lawrence's position as a major in the Virginia militia, as well as his estate. So here is where George's military career begins. Within 2 years, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel. But before that, the governor of Virginia sent Washington out. This is 1754, so Washington is 22 years old, very young man. And he sends Washington to clear the French out of the Ohio country, and we could do a huge, long thing on this. So, Virginia claimed the Ohio country, which is to the west. It's much of what is the modern state of Ohio, but other parts as well. Washington and his force of 100 were surrounded, and they were sent back home by the superior French force at the forks of the Ohio. So Washington's job was, as a super young man, was to go and tell these French, go away. And the French said, no, you go away. So he went away. A year later, the British government sent regular troops to the colonies. And by the way, this is the beginning of what we call the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. So Washington goes along with this outfit. It's a bigger group of soldiers. They're led by a general this time, Edward Braddock. Washington serves on his staff as a volunteer. They marched to Fort Duquesne, but they were ambushed at the Battle of the Monongahela, which I've mentioned in passing before. General Braddock was killed, but Washington helped rally the survivors, and he led them back to Virginia. There's several other future Revolutionary War big shots that were in this battle. General Gage was in it. He wasn't a general at the time, but Thomas Gage, a man named Horatio Gates, we'll talk about him later, so as well as others. So Washington becomes a hero, but he's the guy who, made the best of the situation and brought the troops back to Virginia safely, even though it was a loss. Washington desperately wanted to get a commission in the regular British Army, but they just wouldn't give it to him. He just couldn't talk him into making him a regular British officer. Scott, can you imagine?
That's an interesting counterfactual history of what would have happened. Yeah. Yeah.
What if if you had just made Washington an officer in the British Army, maybe you wouldn't have had this revolution, or maybe you would have won it. But anyway, that's not what happened. And so Washington, for a long time, is going to carry kind of a chip on his shoulder because they wouldn't take him. They rejected him. In 1759, he marries Martha Custis, a very wealthy widow, and this immediately shoots him up in the ranks of the wealthiest people in Virginia. He takes a seat in the House of Burgesses, and he leaves the militia. He lives as a wealthy farmer. running a plantation. He owns a couple hundred slaves. He's raising tobacco and other crops. And during the time when he is working on his plantation, he becomes increasingly disillusioned with the British government. As we've seen, we saw in our very first episode, the British government enacted a series of taxes, and these hit the people of Virginia just as badly as they did the people of Boston, which we focused on. They also restricted Western settlement. In 1763, they issued a proclamation saying you couldn't settle or have any land west of the Appalachian Mountains, and that caused Washington to lose a lot of land that he had claimed. So Washington is becoming increasingly anti-British. In 1774, he was selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He didn't really make a lot of waves there. And then in 1775, as we have seen, the governor of, I think we mentioned this, Scott, the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, made a proclamation or issued a proclamation, and he promised to free any slaves who would run away to British lines. He even organized some of the runaways into an Ethiopian regiment, and he did have several hundred run away. This proclamation struck terror into the hearts of the Virginia gentry. This is really going to rock your world if you're a big slave owner like Washington was. Or there's others like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. So that makes the elite of Virginia, the leaders of the colony, it makes them even more anti-British. And as we've seen, Washington was elected to the Second Continental Congress. And as I mentioned, he wore his old militia uniform to the meetings. He was put in charge of a committee to build defenses of New York City, and then another committee to help supply the army. And then, as we saw, he was offered overall command of the Continental Army. Washington was a very humble man. He said, "I this day state with the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." But he took it anyway. I think he really wanted it. I don't know if this was false humility. I mean, I think he probably thought he was up to the task, but I think he did realize it was going to be a hard thing, because remember, he'd never been more than a lieutenant colonel. He'd commanded Virginia militia throughout the war, the previous war, but he had not led a gigantic army like he was about to be doing. And he, as you mentioned before, he was a very impressive man. He was over 6 feet tall. I've heard everything between 6'0" and 6'2". Very strong, had incredibly powerful arms and legs. Probably would have been if they'd had the Highland Games back then, he would have won it. He would have been one of these power lifters or something. But anyway, but they didn't have that. But everybody that saw him just could not help but be impressed by him. Let me give you one example. There was a doctor and a patriot leader, Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush keeps popping up everywhere. He's in the John Adams series all throughout. This is what Rush wrote. He said, Washington, quote, has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people. There is not a king in Europe that would not look like a valet de chambre by his side. Ooh. In the words, a butler, basically, a chamber valet. So that's pretty amazing quote there. And then finally, Washington arrives in the army, and when he appeared, Nathaniel Greene, he wrote, joy was visible on every countenance, and it seemed as if the spirit of conquest breathed through the whole army. So just by showing up, Washington lifted the spirits of the army, but he's going to have a big job ahead of him.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. So he's sort of like some opponents of Napoleon would say if he was present in the battle, it was like having an extra 10,000 troops there. Or like Gandalf at the Siege of Gondor, who's able to inspire hope in the troops when the Witch King is there. I think
Absolutely.
Maybe Tolkien references will be the thing.
We've got to work Tolkien into every episode.
Yeah, I made a few here, so hey, we'll just keep going.
Very good. But as I always tell my students, these militia units that were around Boston, they were declared to be the Continental Army, and they were